So we're going to start where we left off last time. I always start this portion of the class with a humorous clip. This portion of the class is going to talk about the different geographical regions in Texas. The reason that that is important is it's really hard to understand where somebody's coming from politically if you don't understand where they grew up or where they live. If you don't understand how they make a living, where their food and their income and everything else comes from, if you don't understand their social perspective, it's really difficult for you to engage in any sort of meaningful dialogue with them about their political preferences, because all of that really greatly contributes to what you believe in. So this is just kind of a humorous take. I'm hoping that you guys are able to hear it okay. If you're not able to hear it okay and you want to watch it on your own, it's free. You just go to YouTube, put in Bernie, the 5 states of Texas, and this clip will come up. So we're going to watch just a couple minutes of it here.
Carthage is in East Texas, and it's totally different from the rest of Texas, which should be 5 different states, actually. You got your West Texas out there with a bunch of flat ranch. Up north, you got Dallas snobs with the Mercedes. And then you got the Houston, the carcinogenic coast, what I call it, all the way up to Louisiana. Then down south, San Antonio, that's where the Tex meets the Met, like the food. And then in Central Texas, you got the People's Republic of Austin with a bunch of hairy-legged women and liberal fruitcakes. Of course, I left out the Panhandle and a lot of people cities, but Carthage, this is where the South begins. This is life behind the pine curtain.
Okay, so this is the part where I always apologize to anyone who lives in the Panhandle. Really sorry about that, but it is a kind of a funny clip. We will talk about the Panhandle, so no worries there. We're going to switch over now, and we're going to hop back onto our PowerPoint. We're going to start back up on slide 8. If you are following along there with me. And this is just a visual depiction of what that clip is basically talking about. So for those of you who are more visual learners, this is on slide 8 of your PowerPoint. It's also going to be in your textbook. So let's just start our conversation with a discussion of East Texas. Let's talk about what East Texas is known for. East Texas is a social and cultural extension of the Old South. It is basically rural and biracial. East Texas counties and towns are often dominated by old families whose wealth is usually based on real estate, banking, construction, and retail merchandising. Fundamentalist Protestantism dominates the region when it comes to spiritual context and permeates its political, social, and cultural activities as well. The Gulf Coast. Since the discovery of oil, the Gulf Coast has experienced almost continuous growth. In addition to being a petrochemical center, the Gulf Coast is one of the most important shipping centers in the nation. It's also really big when it comes to tourism because they have a very large cruise industry that operates out of the Gulf Coast. A boom based in Houston. When your textbook talks about a boom based in Houston, they're talking about something that happened as a result of growth in the Gulf Coast area. This created a boomtown psychology, and the Houston area especially flourished. Houston's initial growth after World War II was fueled by a flood of job seekers from East Texas and other rural areas of the state. Houston's social and economic elite were generally composed of second and third generation rich, whose wealth came from oil, insurance, construction, land development, or sometimes banking. Houston, oftentimes, is known as the oil and gas capital of not just the United States, but some people also consider it the worldwide oil and gas capital. And it boasts a lot of corporate headquarters, such as for BP. South Texas. This is also going to be referred to as the Rio Grande Valley. So the Rio Grande Valley is just an area along the Texas side of the Rio Grande River, known for its production of citrus fruit. So this area, its economy is largely based on agriculture. And it's also based in this ranchero culture, which was a quasi-feudal system whereby a property owner or patron would give the workers protection and employment in return for their loyalty and service. The rancher or ranchero and workers all lived on the ranch. This general atmosphere, the general political sentiment, as well as a lot of the industries, carry over to far west Texas as well. Far west Texas is known for being very similar to that Rio Grande Valley region in terms of political culture. A lot of this has to do with the fact that it's a very bicultural area. So it encompasses two cultures, both the culture of the United States and also the culture of Mexico. Because again, just based on geographic proximity, far west Texas is going to have a lot of close ties to the Mexico region. One of the things that this resulted in was far south Texas and far west Texas were both very fond of NAFTA. NAFTA just stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it was a treaty that helped remove trade barriers among Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It was really an economic stimulus for the Texas border, not so much for some other areas of the United States. What it did was it basically took away the tariffs that were on imports and exports between those three North American countries. It made it a lot easier for American companies to produce goods out of Mexico, or for Canadian companies to produce goods out of the United States. Oftentimes they were doing this because they could get labor and parts a lot cheaper in those other countries. Now, for areas of the Midwest, what that resulted in was a lot of jobs were moved over to Mexico, which meant a lot of people ended up unemployed. So that's why you heard it be really controversial, and a lot of people in other areas of the country not like it very much. Kind of did the opposite for Texas, because what happened with Texas is we had all of this transport and commerce that was happening really across the Texas line. So you had roadways that had to be built. You had little towns that were going to spring up. You had people who needed to be employed to inspect produce and goods that were coming across the two areas. So as a result of that, you really saw an economic boom in far west Texas and far south Texas in particular. So those areas tended to really like NAFTA on the whole. That was not the opinion of everyone. Other people also like NAFTA because it meant you could get cheaper goods. If instead of costing $20 to produce a television set, you could go over to Mexico and produce it for $10, some of that savings was passed over to the consumer. So that whole NAFTA discussion, if you remember hearing about that in the news, that's what NAFTA was all about. On the whole, Texas benefited from NAFTA. Well, because it became this very partisan issue and a lot of people started not really liking it too terribly much, what you see is you tended to see this shift away from NAFTA. And so you can see this. President Trump obviously was not a big fan of this. And so he basically switched it over to a different type of agreement called the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, which I always have to look up the name for that. And I don't believe that your textbook is a recent enough publication to have that update, but I anticipate that it will in the future. So the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement is really similar in nature to what we saw in NAFTA. It does provide some additional protections when it comes to dairy farming as well as automobile production. But other than that, pretty similar deal. Okay. So part of why that far West Texas region benefited as well was because of maquiladores, which are those Mexican factories where the U.S. corporations can employ inexpensive Mexican labor for assembly and piecework. So this deals with that concept that we were just discussing, where we're basically, instead of creating things over in the United States where we have to pay workers more and the cost of goods is higher, instead we were able to basically export those operations over to Mexico. The German Hill Country. So the German Hill Country is the area north and west of San Antonio, and it was settled primarily by immigrants from Germany, but also by Czech, Polish, and Norwegian immigrants. It's primarily a farming and ranching area. The Hill Country is socially and politically conservative, and it's for a very long time been a stronghold of the Texas Republican Party. West Texas is going to be an area that is socially and politically conservative. And its religion tends to lean a little bit more fundamentalist, so they tend to be more conservative on the whole. Southern West Texas is the major oil-producing area of Texas. So northern West Texas is primarily agricultural, cotton, things like that. The Panhandle. See, I promised you we were going to talk about the Panhandle, even though we picked on them a little bit earlier. Although railroads advancing from Kansas City through the Panhandle brought Midwestern farmers into this region, the modern Texas Panhandle shares few cultural attributes of the American Midwest. Its religious, cultural, and social institutions function with little discernible difference to those of northern West Texas. The Panhandle economy is also supported by production of cotton and grains, and the area depends heavily on the aquifer in that region. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to get to the part that you guys are probably all most excited about. We're going to talk about North Texas. So when we refer to North Texas, we're talking about the area that's located between East and West Texas. North Texas today tends to be dominated by the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. It's often called the Metroplex. So the Metroplex, when you hear that referred to, if you're not from around here, is just the greater Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. It includes Hurst, Euless, Bedford, all that. It is more economically diverse than most other Texas regions, but it does rely heavily on banking, insurance, and the defense and aerospace industry. So if you think about North Texas for a minute and you think about the different industries that are here, we've got Lockheed Martin, so we've got the defense aspect that we were talking about a minute ago. We've got Alcon, which is going to be a huge scientific employer for this region. We have a number of different universities that are here. We've got a number of different medical institutions. So we're diverse in terms of our economic structure, much more than you see in a lot of the other portions of the state. Central Texas is often called the core area of Texas. It has three corners: Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth, and San Antonio. The centerpiece of that region, and what most people think of when they're thinking of Central Texas, is Austin, which has become the Silicon Valley of high-tech industries in Texas. So if you're in Austin, or if you've been in Austin recently, you'll notice that it has a lot of traffic, a lot of people. Part of what accounts for this is we've seen a big technology boom in that area. So we've got a lot of transplants who've come in from California as well as from New York. That area tends to be pretty liberal to begin with. And obviously the fact that there are a lot of California and New York transplants is not making it any more conservative than it was. It has the University of Texas there, which is our flagship university for the state of Texas. And so that university also employs a lot of individuals as well. Also, in case you're not from the state of Texas, Austin is our capital. And so there's a lot of government workers who work there. Okay. So now we're going to switch gears, and we are going to go over to equal rights. Now, a lot of this looks a little bit like history, because it is. And the reason that we talk about history within a government class is it's important to understand where we've been, to understand what's going on right now and where we're headed. So these historical impediments that we're going to see that were placed to these different groups, those are going to be impediments with long-lasting effects into the present day. So while we're talking about this portion, I don't want you to just focus on what's happening back then. I want you to think about what are the ramifications today and into the future of these different struggles that people have had in the state of Texas. Okay, so female Texans, for those of you who were from here, you probably know that at one time we were our own nation. We were the Republic of Texas. And at that time, things were not looking super great. We weren't able to vote. We weren't able to serve on juries. And we did retain some basic property rights, though. We're going to talk about that. Our property rights were really constrained. But in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about what property rights we did have. So married women retained some Spanish law benefits because unlike under Anglo-Saxon law, Texas marriage law did not join the married couple into one legal person with the husband as the head. Texas married women could own inherited property, share ownership in community property, and make a legal will. However, the husband had control of all the property, both separate and community, including earned income. An employer could not hire a married woman without her husband's consent. Okay, let's break that down into kind of just more normal people language. What that means is, in Texas, when you married with somebody else, you were basically going to share the property that was acquired during the course of that marriage, which meant that in name, women were going to have an interest in all of those marital assets. It also meant that women had the right to inherit property. But when we get to Chapter 3, we're going to talk about all of the restraints that are touched on here in this chapter. And you're going to see that even though it could legally be titled in a woman's name, she didn't really have any control over that property in a practical sense. If she wanted to lease that property, she needed permission from her husband. If she wanted to sell that property, she needed permission from her husband. So while legally titled in her name, which was better than in some other areas, it still was not great. So how did we go about trying to improve things for women? Well, there was one woman in particular. Her name was Minnie Fisher Cunningham. I'm going to have y'all just take a look at her right here. She was a champion for women's suffrage in the state. Texas, as a result of her actions, was one of the first southern states to ratify the 19th Amendment. And as we all know, the 19th Amendment is what gave women the right to vote. So until 1920, women did not have the right to vote, which I know sounds like a long time ago. You're saying it's 100 years ago. And yes, I'm aware. But that does have lasting impact in terms of women's voice in politics. You do tend to see more males in politics today than females. So certainly not the only reason, but history does play a part in what happens currently. Minnie Fisher Cunningham was very devoted to working as a suffragist. She actually studied medicine, which for her to have done that during that time is a pretty incredible feat. It was not like today. Women didn't tend to have advanced degrees. And she also went and kind of led a revolt against the Texas governor at the time, who was opposed to women having the right to vote. She basically formed this whole coalition of individuals who were dedicated to trying to defeat him and make sure that they got the right to vote, which of course they eventually did through the 19th Amendment. The Marital Property Act was our next big step in terms of progress. So the Marital Property Act amounted to major steps towards women's equality. The act granted married women equal rights in insurance, banking, real estate, contracts, divorce, child custody, and property rights. It was actually a pretty landmark deal. It was the first such comprehensive family law in the United States. So it went in and reformed a lot of that we were just talking about a minute ago. You want to work as a woman in Texas, now you don't need your husband's permission anymore. You want to sell your land that you legally own, that you legally inherited, okay, well, the Marital Property Act is going to allow you to do that. Another really big area that it opened up for women was the area of divorce. So prior to the passage of this act, it was exceptionally difficult for a woman to get a divorce in Texas. She had to usually prove one of two things. Number one being that her husband wasn't just cheating on her, but had set up a whole other household. Or number two, that her husband was not just beating her, but beating her so badly that there was a significant chance that she would die. With one of those two things, she could divorce, but then there was very little chance she was going to get the children. So the Marital Property Act basically put women and men on more equal footing when it came to divorce, allocation of their assets, their ability to get a divorce, as well as who got the kiddos in the divorce. So the Marital Property Act was a really big deal. It was a really, really big comprehensive reform that was passed. Okay. Now, your textbook briefly talks about Roe v. Wade. We're going to talk a little bit about it here because it's not going to make any sense if we just go into the women's whole health case, which is that 2016 abortion decision that's referenced on your slides. So prior to the passage of Roe v. Wade, abortion was not legal nationwide. It was up to the individual states to decide whether or not they were going to allow abortion providers to provide services within their state. That meant that in New York, you could do it, for example, but in Texas, you couldn't. Well, there was this woman in Texas, her name was Norma McCorvey, and she already had kids, and I believe she might have already placed one up for adoption before, and she decided that she wanted an abortion, but abortions weren't legal in the state of Texas. So she sued for the right to get an abortion. It went up to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1973, the United States Supreme Court found that women have a fundamental privacy interest in their own bodies when it comes to reproductive support. This was actually a continuation of an earlier decision, but we're going to not talk about that too much because we don't want to get too far down the rabbit trail. But it basically found that women have the right, the constitutional right, to an abortion. Well, as you can imagine, there were a lot of states that were not very happy about this, Texas among them. And so the next big case that comes out in abortion rights is in the 90s. And it's this case called Casey versus Planned Parenthood. And I don't think that your textbook actually talks about this, but I feel like it's helpful to hear about Casey in order to understand what comes next. So in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, the United States Supreme Court was dealing with states wanting to put restrictions on abortion. So all the states knew that they couldn't just go in and say, you can't have abortions here anymore, women. But they didn't know whether or not they could place regulations. Well, in Pennsylvania, they decided that they were going to place certain regulations around abortion. And this was challenged at the United States Supreme Court level. And what the United States Supreme Court said in that case was states can impose restrictions on abortions as long as they don't pose what's called an undue burden. Now, the tricky part became they didn't really define what was or what wasn't an undue burden. So every time you see a legislature come out with these new abortion restrictions, that's what the court is always going to have to examine. Not whether or not the state can place a restriction, but whether that restriction places an undue burden. So just remember, those are kind of the magical words, undue burden. If it poses an undue burden to women, then the restriction is unconstitutional. If the restriction does not pose an undue burden to women, then it's deemed to be constitutional. So that's going to bring us up to that 2016 abortion decision that we were talking about. This is one of those moments where I generally show my class a clip just to give you an overview of what it is that we're talking about. So what you see in this clip is Wendy Davis, and she's a Texas senator, or she was a Texas senator, I should say, and she basically stood up for a very long time to try to run out the clock on a legislative session where it was very likely that a bill was going to be passed that was going to make abortion services in Texas very, very limited. She knew that the bill had the number of votes necessary to pass, and so she was basically trying to run out the clock here through something called a filibuster that we're going to talk about in later chapters. So this is the part where I'm going to show you the clip. If you can't see it or you can't hear it, you can go over to YouTube, put in Wendy Davis, Texas, I'll not yield, and it's going to be that YouTube clip that comes up. It says, I'll not yield, Wendy Davis takes a stand in Texas. Let's go ahead and switch over so we can see that. Okay, you can't see it. All right.
On abortion doctors and clinics.
SB 5 would ban abortions after the 20th week of pregnancy and also effectively shut down most abortion clinics in Texas because it would limit abortions to surgical centers instead.
Now, the Senate vote on this is expected tomorrow unless Democrats delay past the midnight deadline.
Okay, and so I'm going to say before I start this that there are a lot of people who show up to this particular vote, and it gets pretty heated. So there is a curse word in the clip. I feel like for most of you, that's probably not going to be a big deal, but if you find it offensive, then just know that there is a curse word in this clip that's coming up, and so you might want to skip over it. We'll talk about it afterwards, so you don't have to see it if you don't want to.
Wearing her comfortable pink sneakers because she wouldn't be allowed to sit down for 13 hours. Texas State Senator Wendy Davis took the podium and took a stand.
Members, I'm rising on the floor today to humbly give voice to thousands of Texans. I would hate to see other families denied the right to choose what is best for them. These decisions are hard enough without placing extra limits on them. It's very frustrating to feel like the choices you have made for your baby's life and death are not being respected. Many women suffer from minor to severe medical complications. I'm not yielding for any questions at this point. Thank you.
Senator does not yield.
According to Texas filibuster rules, Davis had to stay on topic, could not lean on anything, and could not take a bathroom break. And she would continue to speak until just under the 11-hour mark, when Republican Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst ruled Davis violated the Senate's three-strike rule. Strike one was Davis's mention of Planned Parenthood, which Republicans said was off topic. Strike two came when a colleague offered Davis a sack break 7 hours into the filibuster, violating the lean policy. Can you believe this?
No.
And the final strike came when Davis mentioned the state's 2011 sonogram law. Again, off topic, really?
Mr. Campbell, your point of order is well taken and is sustained. The chair recognizes Senator Davis for a motion.
what's happening right now is that the filibuster was essentially dead, but now it might be coming back to life because Senator Kirk Watson from right here in Austin, he actually asked for an appeal on the decision that was made by the Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst to shut this filibuster down, apparently. And then what happened after that is been a bunch of arguments.
Because of parliamentary inquiry.
The state tree inquiry.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
The issue before the body is the previous question. The secretary will call the roll.
Sewell, Johnson, Ellis, Estes, Frazier, Garcia,
Members, we are in the middle of a vote. The secretary is calling the vote. If we can have order in the chamber so that the members can properly cast their vote. If I can have order, we will suspend the roll call vote until we can get order in the chamber. Cooper shoved this woman, pushed her back, and arrested her. Other women were also grabbed and dragged. They were angry that the Republican lawmakers used parliamentary tactics to stop Senator Wendy Davis' filibuster before midnight. Lawmakers then scrambled to vote in time, approving the bill. But then this morning, a stunner. The Lieutenant Governor confirming that the timing of that vote was changed in the computer. The vote was actually taken after midnight.
This is free from Senator Wendy.
Okay, so you guys can obviously see that there were a lot of people who were really pretty upset about this issue. What happened after that is that, and we're going to talk about this in another chapter, the governor has the ability to call the legislature back into session for a very limited purpose and for a limited period of time. And so the governor did that. And so ultimately, this bill ends up passing. Well, as you can see there, the bill passed in 2013. It goes up to the United States Supreme Court in 2016. And in 2016, we see that women's whole health decision that we were talking about before. So let's grab that real quick out of our PowerPoint. Okay, all right. Now you guys can see it, or you should be able to see it. Okay, so what happens is the court examines that issue in 2016.
Okay, hold your walk.
And remember, what they're trying to figure out is does this pose an undue burden to women? So they've got to figure out, in particular, this issue of widening the hallways that was expressed in that clip. If you go in and you widen hallways, it requires you to make architectural changes to a building. Some of those walls are probably going to be load-bearing, which means it's really expensive to go in and do those renovations. The practical result is that a lot of clinics had to shut in Texas. Texas stated that the reason it did this was because it wanted 2 medical gurneys to be able to go through the hallways at the same time in the event that there were 2 medical emergencies happening, And they also stated that they wanted doctors to have automatic admitting privileges to local hospitals so that if there was an emergency, their patients could basically be automatically admitted. Well, when the court considers this in 2016, they basically say that's an undue burden. There's never been an instance that Texas can cite where two medical gurneys at an abortion surgical center needed to go down the hallway at the same time. And in addition, if you're having a medical emergency, by law, a hospital has to take you in, regardless of whether or not your doctor has admitting privileges there. So they found that these restrictions weren't for a legitimate purpose. They found that instead they caused an undue burden to women seeking abortion services. And so ultimately, that bill that was passed in Texas is struck down. So it's no longer good law. Now, why do we talk about it now? Well, number one, Texas is usually at the forefront of pushing for legislation that would limit women's constitutional rights in these ways. Number two, we also talk about it right now because there's actually a Supreme Court case out of Louisiana that's being heard this term that deals with a case that looks incredibly similar to this Texas case. So that's something, if you're politically active, to pay attention to. A lot of people are watching it to see what happens with regards to that case. And number three, the thing I always point out to people is think about when that bill was passed, and then think about when the United States Supreme Court rendered a decision in this case. The bill passes in 2013, and ultimately, the court says that law is unconstitutional. But it takes a long time to make its way up to the United States Supreme Court, as it does with most cases. And so for 3 years, you have a violation, a deprivation of women's rights, because what Texas did was impose an undue burden, which the court has said is unconstitutional. So any time that we talk in this course about challenging something through the court system, understand that the long-term ramifications of that can mean that women are denied access, or if we're talking about voting, that individuals who are less privileged will be denied access to voting for a long period of time, and that can have future effects as well. So I always just try to point that out to my class and make sure that they understand that it's not about just what was happening in 2013 or 2016. That has real-world repercussions on what's happening right now. Okay, so that is the women's struggle for equal rights in Texas. Now let's talk about African American struggle. So African Americans in Texas have not always had the easiest time of it. One of the things that is pretty difficult for African Americans was something called the white primary. So just so that you understand and have some context in case you're not already aware, a primary election is for each party. So the Democrats are going to have a primary and the Republicans are going to have a primary. And that primary system is where the party decides, okay, which of our potential candidates is going to end up on the general election ballot come November. Well, what happened in Texas for a long period of time is the Democrats only held a white primary. This is where they went in and excluded African Americans from primary elections in the Texas Democratic Party. Okay, so now you're probably wondering, okay, well, that wasn't in the general election, so is that really a big deal? And the answer to that is yes, it's a very big deal, because at the time, the Democratic Party was actually dominating in Texas, which meant it was almost kind of a foregone conclusion for a very long period of time that whoever made it to the general ballot as a Democrat was going to be the person who was elected to statewide office. Well, if you have an all-white primary, it means then that those African Americans aren't able to actually give meaningful input on who's ultimately going to be the general candidate, who's ultimately probably going to be elected. So even though it's the primary system, it had effects on the general election. And that's why we care about the white primary. The other thing that was deterring individuals from voting was the Ku Klux Klan, which is abbreviated KKK. The KKK was a white supremacist organization. Along with local law officers and the Texas Rangers, the KKK actively participated in violence and intimidation of both Latinos and African American Texans to keep them in their segregated place. They didn't limit it just to Latinos and African Americans, but really that's where they targeted most of their efforts. So if an African American went and registered to vote, for example, they might take some kind of terrible action against him, his family, or his property. So even though African Americans legally had the right to go out and cast their vote, the KKK was basically intimidating them and trying to keep them from the polls. So this is the part where we start seeing some sort of opposition to what's happening to African Americans, particularly in the South. The NAACP form, which the NAACP, understand, is still in existence today. But when it was formed, we had a different vocabulary. We used different words. So it was formed as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That used to be the term that was appropriate. Now we don't say colored people, we say African Americans. But the NAACP still exists. And it's basically this group of individuals who organize together and are trying to fight for African American equality in America. This can take many different forms, but oftentimes they're going to target the judicial branch. So they're going to go in and challenge different practices through the court system to try to enact change for African Americans. So one of the cases that they really spearhead is this case of Sweat versus Painter. In 1946, Heman Sweat applied for admission to the University of Texas Law School, which by Texas law was segregated. But during this time, state laws requiring segregation were constitutional as long as facilities serving African Americans and whites were equal. So if you think back to your history class, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, that was the prevailing law at the time. Because Texas had no law school for African Americans, the legislature hurriedly established a law school for Sweat and for his quote-unquote convenience, located in his hometown of Houston. Originally, before they constructed this new law school, they actually basically gave him a broom closet and some textbooks. Well, what the court found was that this school was not, in fact, equal. And part of why this case is really important is that it's the first time that the court really starts to question, can separate ever really be equal? So think about that question for a minute. Can separate ever really be equal? If you're separating people, aren't you inherently saying something? You're inherently saying that you think that one group is better than the other group. And so this is the first time that you really see the court really grappling with this question. And it ultimately is going to lead to Brown versus Board of Education. So Brown versus Board of Education was the case in which that Plessy versus Ferguson rule of separate but equal was overturned, and all of the school districts needed to integrate. The next big case for African Americans in Texas that we see is going to be United States versus Texas. So Brown versus Board came out in 1956. United States versus Texas comes out in 1970 and orders the complete desegregation of all Texas public schools. So you're probably at home wondering, well, didn't that already happen in 1956? Well, yes, it did. But the problem was that a lot of schools, particularly in the South, but not just the South, heard it and were basically like, yeah, that's cool. We're not going to do that. And so what this did was it ordered this really extensive desegregation and included the process for how that desegregation was going to take place in very exact detail. So this was basically the federal court coming in and saying, okay, states, you didn't listen to us when we talked to you in 1956, and you thought that you didn't have to listen to us, but you do. So we are going to lay out a very explicit plan for you to follow to make sure that you desegregate your school. So United States versus Texas, 1970. I want you to think about that for a second. It probably feels like forever ago to you, but 1970 was not really that long ago. So chances are your parents were alive and probably in school in the 1970s. And if your parents received an inferior education and didn't have the opportunity to go to college, that has effects on you and on your children and on your grandchildren. Because if you get a college diploma, your kids are more likely to get a college diploma. If you get a high school diploma, your kids are more likely to get a high school diploma. Same thing for all levels of education. So the fact that really not that long ago, we still didn't have the level of desegregation that we would like to see is a big deal. And there's actually something called the Texas History Project that y'all might check out. And it basically details some individuals' struggles with higher education during that period of time. Okay, so this is just a picture of Mr. Sweat there for you. And now we are going to move on and we are going to talk about Latino Texans. So like most African Texans, Latinos are relegated to the lowest paid jobs as either service workers or farm workers. The Raymondville peonage cases in 1929 tested for the first time the legality of forcing vagrants or debtors to repay farmers by requiring them to work off debts and fines as labor on private farms. So peonage is basically just another word for indentured servitude. So this case was really about indentured servitude. What was happening was we had those patrons, those really wealthy landowners who were bringing over Mexican migrants to work their land and saying, okay, we brought you over, we gave you safe passage, we've paid off any other debts that you owe, now you owe us indefinitely. And so you need to work this land. And in exchange, we'll like feed and clothe you and do all that stuff. Well, the court ultimately said, yeah, that's not really so good. We don't allow indentured servitude here. That feels an awful lot like slavery. So we're not going to let that happen. That was kind of the first big reform we saw for Latino Texans. Next, we see Hector Garcia, who founds the American GI Forum. So Dr. Hector Garcia organized the American GI Forum in a Corpus Christi elementary school classroom in March of 1948. This organization spread throughout the United States and played an important role in giving Latino Americans full citizenship and civil respect. Part of what sparked the initiation of the GI Forum was Dr. Hector Garcia had served over in World War II, as had a lot of other Latino individuals. And what happened was this Latino soldier who fought in World War II very bravely and was killed during battle came back and basically wasn't buried, wasn't allowed to be buried in the cemetery in that hometown because it was an all-white cemetery. So he'd gone and he had fought for his country, but still wasn't allowed to be buried in the hometown cemetery. And so you saw Latino Texans really start to fight back at that moment and really try to devote themselves to advancing Latino Texan rights. Important to Latinos was the case of Hernandez versus Texas. This comes out in 1954. It's a case with an all-Anglo jury, and it was in the small town of Edna. So in Edna, they convicted Pete Hernandez of murder in 1950. And his attorneys challenged the conviction. They argued that the systematic exclusion of Latinos from jury duty in Texas violated Hernandez's right to equal protection under the law, guaranteed by the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So what had happened is when you go in for jury duty, there's the prosecution and the defense, and they ask you a bunch of questions. And then both sides have the ability to strike you for various reasons that we're going to talk about later in this course. Well, what happened on the prosecution side is they were basically going in and they were striking any of the prospective jurors who were Latino. So if you were Latino, they were basically excluding you, keeping you from being on this individual's jury. And they weren't making any qualms about it. They were doing it totally on the basis of race. Well, is that really fair? Are you really getting equal protection under the law if everybody who looks like you and probably comes from your same community is being stricken from the jury? Probably not, right? And that's what the court decides in Hernandez versus Texas. Okay. So now let's talk about LGBTQ rights in Texas. All right. We've got Lawrence versus Texas, DOMA, United States versus Windsor, and also Obergefell versus Hodges. Okay. So let's start with Lawrence versus Texas. So this starts with a little bit of a sensitive topic. Harris County Sheriff's deputy discovered two men having intimate sexual conduct in a private residence. Everybody's always like, how, why? Complicated story. They did not have a warrant, but there's basically an exception where they were allowed to come in because they thought there were emergent circumstances. So police officers come into this apartment, they think for totally legitimate reasons. They find these two individuals engaged in intimate sexual conduct, and they are the same sex. Well, in Texas during that time, that was illegal. So they arrest them, and they convict them for violating a Texas anti-sodomy statute. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in Lawrence versus Texas that the Texas law violated the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, which does not protect sodomy, but does protect personal relationships. So that decision, because it came out of the United States Supreme Court, also invalidated sodomy laws in 13 other states, which protected same-sex behavior in every state and territory in the United States, which, again, is one of those things that at this point we think, how could there have been anti-sodomy laws? But it really was not that long ago. That case was decided in 2003. So it really was not very long ago that this was going on. The Defense of Marriage Act was in some ways the government's response to what was happening in Lawrence versus Texas. So Lawrence versus Texas is the first time that we see LGBTQ rights really protected on the national stage. And so people who are a little bit more resistant to that idea decide that they are going to try to impose barriers to make sure that those rights don't expand. Because the next area that LGBTQ individuals are going to hope to expand on in terms of their personal rights is going to be the right to marriage. So the Defense of Marriage Act defined marriage as a legal union between a man and a woman, and further stipulated that hostile states do not have to recognize same-gender marriage contracts from other states. Okay. What was happening was there were some states that were totally okay with this idea, and so they were letting people get married. And there were other states like Texas who were not okay with this idea, and so they were not allowing same-sex individuals to be married. At first, it seemed like, okay, maybe that will work. But if you think about that a little bit more in depth, you realize that's not going to work out very well. Because what you're going to have is, in one state, they were allowed to be married, right? So the same-sex couple moves from the state that allowed same-sex unions over to Texas. And now let's say they want to get divorced. How do you get divorced in a state that doesn't recognize that you're married? You can't. So dividing up property, figuring out kiddos, figuring out child support, it's all going to become just a more complicated process, not to mention the fact that you're still legally married in that state and you can't get divorced because the state that you now reside in, which would have the ability to hear your case, doesn't recognize that you were married in the first place. So there's that issue. There's also the issue of, on the federal level, what do? Can you file your returns as married, filing jointly? Do they need to be separate tax returns? Does it make a difference which state you're living in? It's all in these sort of complicated issues. And so ultimately, what happens in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges is the United States Supreme Court says, yeah, that's not really working. Texas, by an overwhelming majority of 76% prior to that case, added an amendment to the Texas Constitution in 2005 that banned both gay and lesbian marriage and civil unions. So when Obergefell versus Hodges came out in 2015, you saw that law, or I should say that amendment to the Constitution, invalidated, as well as the laws and amendments to other states' constitutions invalidated as well. So we're going to talk more when we get to the next chapter, but if there's a conflict between state and federal law, the federal government is always going to win out there. Okay. This is basically just a review of those cases that we've already talked about. So if you need kind of a little quick overview for you, you've got it here in the form of this chart. And then just really briefly to show you where we're headed. The end of this chapter talks about cultural diversity today. So Texas is one of the fastest growing states, and Texas is becoming more culturally diverse all the time. This could have an impact on a wide range of things, from politics, culture, voter participation, income, and poverty. And to kind of look at that more in depth, we're going to go to this next slide here. This shows you from 1980 to 2017 what's been going on with the different populations in Texas. So in red is Anglo, which you could see back in 1980 was 68% or 66%. I don't know. I can't see it well enough, but a lot, the majority. Whereas if you go over to 2017, you can see that the Anglo population is actually declining in the state of Texas. And the light blue, which is going to be the Latino population, is increasing over time. So that is going to change the makeup of the state for a number of reasons, some of which are going to deal with poverty levels and the effects of poverty levels. So this graph shows you here which groups statistically earn more than other groups. Asian Americans are going to be at the very top here, followed by Anglos. And when we talk about percentage living in poverty, we see that Anglos are actually going to be the lowest group. Whereas if we were to look at groups by percentage of who is living in poverty, we can see that Latinos are going to be the highest group. So what you're going to see is, on the whole, we've got a lot of individuals in Texas who tend to be making less money. We've got a lot of less educated individuals, a lot of lower income individuals. That means that they're going to need more social services. So they're going to need to be able to get some assistance sometimes with food, housing, with other social programs like Head Start. You're also going to see this make a difference in terms of voting. And we've got a whole chapter that's basically devoted to that. So really big factors in terms of voter participation deal with income and poverty level. But also, statistically speaking, Latinos and African Americans, remember, tend to vote differently than their Anglo counterparts. So we might eventually see that make some difference in the political stage here in Texas as well. So that's just kind of foreshadowing of what's to come in the upcoming chapters. This is going to be the end here of Chapter 1. The next presentation that I'll be uploading is for Chapter 2.